Can you tell me what was Jesus' first miraculous act recorded in the Gospels? Okay. Now, this is not meant to be a trick question. You see, in John chapter 2, where it talks about Jesus turning water into wine at the wedding at Cana, it's said to be the first miraculous sign to his disciples. So it's the first sign to his disciples that he did in John chapter 2. But go back a chapter, it tells us, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Well, who is the Word here? We know who that is. But it tells us, through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. So, in fact, even before he was born, he was a creator of the universe. Hang on, he's a creator of the universe. People want to tell us that Darwinism is just a side issue, but Darwinism attacks the whole notion of creation, which is attacking who Jesus Christ is. It's a direct attack on the person of Jesus, is what Darwin is. Now, it's pretty important because God spoke through a prophet. You call him Isaiah, don't you, in America? Because in Australia they call him Isaiah. We're divided by a common language. And they're both wrong anyway, because in Hebrew it's Yeshayahu. So God spoke through Yeshayahu and said, I am the Lord, or Jehovah, and apart from me there is no Savior. So for Jesus to be Savior, he must be God and Creator, not a created being like some of the cultic groups tell us. But he also must be fully man. He is a mediator between God and man, which means he is a member of both groups. He's mediating. And he's also, the same prophet, Isaiah, referred to a redeemer who would be coming. And the word in Hebrew for redeemer, Goel, actually means kinsman redeemer. Now, the point of this is that he must be a blood relative of those whom he redeems. Look in the book of Ruth. And Ruth was one of Jesus' ancestors. If you check the book of Matthew, you'll see that. Now, and that explains the kinsman redeemer's point that he must be a blood relative. Now, how is it possible? Well, we see in the Gospels how Jesus' ancestry is traced. That we see how Matthew's Gospel, writing to a Jewish audience, starts from the first Jew, Abraham, then goes through these King David, through this line of kings here, and ends up with Joseph, and there's a dotted line there because Jesus was virgin born. So this is actually the legal line, not the biological line. Now, Luke's Gospel is actually tracing a biological line because he's tracing from Mary. So Luke goes backwards through Mary. That's why it's pink, because she's a girl, okay? So, and then Mary comes from King David through another son, Nathan, and then to Abraham. But now because Luke is writing to Gentiles, he doesn't stop at Abraham. He goes back even further to people like Noah. And then to Adam, who's called the son of God, not the son of an ape. And it's because all of us come from Adam. No matter what race or people group you belong to, you come from Adam, and therefore you are related to Jesus Christ. Okay? But the thing is, Darwinism denies a literal historical Adam. In fact, the atheistic evolutionist group called Biologos, in fact, the president, Francis Collins, is explicit. He said there's no such person as Adam. Which means you deny the whole kinsman redeemer concept. The whole kinsman redeemer idea goes down the tubes if, in fact, Adam wasn't historical. And the thing is, he is clearly the son of God, and he's not any sort of ape descendant or coming from rearranged pond scum. See, there's no room for evolution in the Gospels. So why aren't people believing this straightforward history backed up by one of the world's best historians of all time, the apostle, the Dr. Luke, who accepted these guys as historical figures, and yet some people, even in the church, don't believe it. And one of the reasons is that they're intimidated by so-called science. Now, one thing to make very clear about what science is supposed to be about. See, the real science that's been so useful for us, that builds all our technology and cures diseases and sent men to the moon, is about things that we can test and observe and repeat, like water boils at 100 degrees. Well, everywhere else in the world it's 100 degrees. Here it's 212 degrees, okay? It's a bit strange. But the point is, it's always going to be 212 degrees, and you can test this for yourself. If you don't believe me, go and boil it yourself. See, this is what real science is about things that you can test, observe, and repeat. But evolution is quite a different thing. Because evolution is a claim about a one-off event in the past, like, say, a fish turned into an amphibian 300 million years ago. I don't see that happening today. How do you test that in the scientific laboratory? And even if you could somehow turn a fish into an amphibian today, it won't have proved that it happened that way 100 million years ago or 300 million years ago. You see, so evolution is actually a claim about history. It's really a historical claim rather than a scientific claim. There's nothing to do with real science. I mean, as I'll explain tomorrow, real scientists have no use for evolution. It doesn't actually affect what they do. In fact, no Nobel Prize has been awarded for evolution, and that's annoyed a lot of evolutionists. But it looks like the Nobel Prize Committee, they may be evolutionists, but they recognize that evolution doesn't have anything useful to contribute to science. Well, as I'll show in my talk tomorrow, it was a biblical worldview that led to modern science in the first place. Now, the reason we would have a different view of this picture from what evolutionists do, because notice there's nothing in the fossil that says it's 300 million years old. That is an interpretation of that fossil. You see, I have the same evidence that they do, but we have different explanations. And I can illustrate that with the Grand Canyon. You see, here is a deep gash in the ground, and you can see these very flat rock layers. Now, evolutionists say this is what a little bit of water did over loads of time. And I say this is what a lot of water did over a little bit of time. So why do we have different explanations for the same data? It's because we have different starting points. The evolutionist actually starts from an assumption there is no global flood, there's no God who actually did anything in history that's measurable. And therefore, what they will have to do is look at the rivers today. They will look at how slowly they carve their banks and work out it would take millions of years for the Colorado River to carve the Grand Canyon. But when you have lots of water, in fact, we can see, in fact, it's in this very state. The Mount St. Helens 30 years ago, a bit over 30 years ago, Mount St. Helens erupted, and one aftermath of that was a huge mud flow carved this little Grand Canyon in just one day. So this is actually proof that if you have lots of water, you don't need lots of time. And this is 1/40th the size of the Grand Canyon. It's about 100 feet deep. Now, but the Mount St. Helens was a very small volcanic eruption by volcanic eruption standards. So you've got nothing like the water that would come off after a global flood, which could do far more damage than just a little eruption like Mount St. Helens. And to try and prevent this happening again, some engineers tried to lower the water of Spirit Lake a bit more gradually, but it didn't work because over 2.5 years, this canyon was formed. Now, you see what's one thing about this canyon, it has a little river going through here. Now, this river did not cause the canyon caused the river. You see, I went to the Colorado River a bit over a year ago. Now, interesting, you go to the rim, and it's very hard to see the Colorado River down there. It's such a tiny little river. And another thing about that is that if the Colorado River carved the Grand Canyon, it would have had to flow uphill to do it. I don't notice rivers doing that very often, okay? So again, what we see with the Grand Canyon is far more likely that you have the runoff of a great flood carving this canyon, and now the Colorado River is following the path already carved out for it. So once again, the Grand Canyon caused the Colorado River, not the other way around. Now, some other things to think about with science. I'll be talking about how science requires the biblical worldview to function, because science requires a lot of different assumptions for it to even get off the ground, what you might call meta-science, the things that are needed for science to work in the first place. Now, that's the title of tomorrow's talk. But now, for this, I'll mention briefly about the difference in how fossils form. Now, once again, there are two different views here. Now, we both of us have fossil. I mean, the fossils don't change whether it's a creationist viewing them or evolutionist viewing them. Now, Chris Ashcraft tomorrow is going to be talking far more about fossils, very much more in depth than what I'm going to do. I'm going to mention briefly, this is how the Darwinist thinks a fossil forms. This is actually from an Australian high school biology textbook. Now, what's it telling us here? It tells us that you have this fishy swimming in the ocean, and it dies, and it sinks to the bottom. And you see out at the top there, you have these continents eroding over millions of years and washing silt into the ocean and burying the fossil really quickly. Now, let's do some real science here. Remember, science is about observation and repetition. What happens to a fish when it dies? I think I heard both the right answers there. That's pretty good. Here is the thing that happens first. It floats. So already you know this picture in the textbook is wrong. But this is what's being taught to high school kids in Australia. And it's probably no different in this country, right? The only difference is Australian high schools actually are allowed to teach the Bible in schools. Interesting, for a much more secular country overall. Now, of course, when you have fish floating, what's going to happen to them next? They're going to be eaten. So this is not going to produce a fossil. I suggest that the way you produce a fossil is to bury it really quickly, which is again what the flood provides with the fountains of the great deep bursting forth. And you bury it quickly. And you see now the scavengers can't get to it. But not only do you need to bury it quickly, you have to have some minerals around so that the bony materials will be replaced by the minerals. And of course, a flood is probably going to have lots of hot water from under the ground. The fountains of the great deep mean hot water from under the ground. It's going to dissolve lots of minerals, which are just the thing you need to replace the bony material with the mineral matter. So the flood is what you would actually produce the huge number of fossils that we see today. Including very big ones, because when you think about burying dinosaur graveyards, you think of the amount of water required to bury all that. Now, Chris tomorrow has some fantastic examples of fossils. I think you'll see how they show extremely rapid burial. You just could not get those fossils slowly and gradually, because Chris has got all these snapshots of fossils which are snap frozen in certain things, which had to happen really quickly. So I'll leave you, make sure you come tomorrow for all that. But also there are other things which show that the things must have happened much more quickly, again in line with the biblical timescale. One of them is stalactites and stalagmites, and this is another picture from Australia. Now, you might have gone on cave tours and they tell you things like these stalactites took millions of years to form. You wonder how they actually know that. Of course, I don't know that. Especially weird when, in fact, you find the caves often have some railings and steps to make it easier for the tourists, and the steps might have some stalagmites growing on them, and the railings have stalactites coming off them. That happens. And the cave guides can't seem to see the contradiction in what they've been telling the tourists. And now here's another example of that. You see, these are very big stalactites and stalagmites because people there look very tiny by comparison. But when you look very closely, you see that's a switchboard there because they're inside a mine shaft. So obviously these stalactites are younger than the mine. Were they mining millions of years ago? So again, when you have the right conditions, you do not need lots of time. Now, we also see some things in Australia which are quite interesting, like the Hawkesbury Sandstone. Now, Three Sisters are not quite part of the Hawkesbury Sandstone. This is a very big tourist attraction in New South Wales, which is the most populous state of Australia. Now, one thing about them, if you look at the Hawkesbury Sandstone layers, is that you have these cross beds when you look very closely. There's some cross beds in them. And this is very good evidence of having been deposited by huge amounts of fast-flowing water to produce, because these are actually truncated sand dunes. Because it shows, when you have a cross bed, it means that this whole section must have been formed at the same time, because otherwise the layers that you wouldn't get these diagonal lines unless you've got something causing the whole layer to be coordinated like that. So what you actually have is truncated sand dunes there. Now, for the longest time, evolutionary geologists were puzzled about how the Hawkesbury Sandstone formed. And it's a very important sandstone in Australia because a lot of the classic buildings in Sydney were made from the Hawkesbury Sandstone. Now, Sydney has 5 million people and it's the biggest city in Australia. Not too many cities in this country are bigger than Sydney. Okay, but that's where the buildings came from. Now, but here is one geologist, a secular geologist, who realized how it was formed. He said a wall of water up to 20 meters high and 250 kilometers wide, coming down from the north at enormous speed, delivered tons of sand into the Sydney area. That's some surfing, isn't it? That sort of wave. Now, when you realize Australia is a very dry continent, a lot of it is desert. That's why it hasn't got as many people as this country has, because so much of it is uninhabitable. But the point is, even a dry desert country like Australia was clearly once covered in raging waters. Again, what you'd expect from the biblical account of a worldwide flood, not one of these silly local floods. And again, Chris is going to talk about that issue tomorrow, that the flood in the Bible is clearly a global flood. But when you see things like this, again, you can see from the science that it was a global flood as well. You've got things all around the world pointing to being submerged by huge amounts of water. Now, another thing we see is also very fine layers have been formed very, very quickly. Like, for instance, again, Mount St. Helens eruption, which you guys in Washington State are all very familiar with. Okay, now one thing that happened with the Mount St. Helens eruption was finding rapid layers being formed. Now, Darwin and Lyell before him would count for layers and assume it was one layer per year. And that's how they got the idea of millions of years, by counting these layers and assuming one layer per year. So you multiply the number of layers, you get the number of years. That's what they assumed. But the thing is, their assumption of one layer per year is completely wrong. And it's shown by Mount St. Helens. Now, this is actually a very small part of this layer here. This one here, rather. You see the lady standing down beneath it? It gives you an idea of how this layer, how thick the layer was, but it turns out this was actually formed in only a single day. Because what happened is you have a pyroclastic flow, which is very hot gas and volcanic ash. And now what's been shown is that when you have horizontal flow and differently sized particles, the flow makes them roll over each other and sort themselves out into alternating layers of coarse and fine, coarse, fine, coarse, fine, coarse, fine. But it's basically one movement, a horizontal movement with the different sized particles forming these layers almost all at once. So the Darwinian assumption of one layer per year is refuted by observation, and recent events like Mount St. Helens proved it. Now, even in Australia, we had the same sort of disproof, because this is actually in Queensland, the state I came from. And what we see here, look how tiny the layers are, because you see sunglasses there for comparison. Very fine and very smooth, very horizontal layers there. Now again, how do these layers get formed? Well, the answer is, it was a very popular tourist beach and it was losing sand, so they borrowed some sand from somewhere else, put it on a tanker, mixed it up with water, 100,000 gallons per minute. We're thinking of how many swimming pools that is, and they poured it onto the beach. And again, underwater, the same horizontal flow and differently sized particles caused the self-sorting into these very fine layers. But I mean, if Darwin had come along to this beach many years later, he might have thought, well, goodness, look how old this beach is. Count all the layers there. But we know it was very quickly formed into these layers. So all you have to do is have a bit of a cementing agent, and you're going to get this formed into a layered rock. The very sorts of layers that we see in the lab today. And in fact, people like Guy Bothell has done experiments in a flume, a huge tank of water, mixing up particles and having it flow, and we get the same sort of layering forming, again with the horizontal flow, pretty much all at once. And in one experiment, he actually found a layered rock, and he broke it up into its individual particles, ran it through the flume, and the same layer thickness was reproduced. Which suggests this is the mechanism for causing it. Again, a single flow and self-sorting, not one thing after another every year. That's not how it forms. And the other thing, of course, you wouldn't expect to find the layers very smooth if, in fact, they were formed slowly and gradually, because you'll get erosion features in them. See, the thing is, what we see sometimes, look at this... Grand Canyon. This is what you see when you come to the surface. Look how jagged the Grand Canyon is. Because it's exposed to the elements. It's very angular at the surface. But when you look within the Grand Canyon, in fact, this photo doesn't do it justice, so compared to going there yourself, you see one pancake layer over another, like this Coconino sandstone. Now, this is so wide, it's actually 200,000 square miles, and it's about 300 feet thick. We're talking about 10,000 cubic miles of sand in the Coconino sandstone. It's an enormous amount of sand to be deposited. Think of the amount of water required to deposit that amount of sand. The thing is, they know it must be water because there are sand dunes there which are just the right angle for being deposited underwater and not under air. And they also find certain tracks of things, like dinosaur tracks, which it looks like the dinosaur's been lifted up and then deposited. So that would be explained if it was water lifting them up. And also, it seems the dinosaurs are bracing against the current, because, you normally walk your feet are parallel to the motion, but if you've got some sort of current, you're walking against a shallow river, you'd probably try and angle your feet to brace against the current. And this is what the footprints look like. The dinosaurs are bracing themselves against a flowing current there. Now, another thing, when you look at where this Coconino sandstone is, it's over a layer of shale. Now, the shale's a very soft rock. And there's supposed to be 12 million years between these two layers. But the thing is, if shale, a soft rock, was exposed to the elements, it would look more like this. And yet, it's extremely flat. So once again, the flatness of the layers shows that it hasn't been exposed to the surface very long. Otherwise, you'd get huge amounts of erosion and not the flat surfaces we see. Another thing we can see in the layer, we have things between the layers. This is called a polystrate fossil, poly meaning many and stratum meaning layer. It's one of these dreadful hybrid words, Greek and Latin hybrid. I don't really like them very much. That's why I don't like television very much either. Same thing. Now, see, the problem is when you try to do this, here is what's quite a few of them there. Now, in coal, in Wales too, it's all over the world we find these polystrate fossils. And one evolutionary geologist in Wales said, if we estimate the thickness of British coal of about 1,000 meters laid down in 10 million years, it would have taken 100,000 years to bury a tree 10 meters high, which is ridiculous. Well, of course, what would happen to the top of a tree when the bottom has been buried? See, wouldn't you love to have timber that could withstand the elements after being exposed for hundreds of thousands of years? Make a lot of money that way. But here's the other thing he says. If a 10-meter tree was buried in 10 years, it would mean 1,000 kilometers in a million years. And this is equally ridiculous, and we can't escape the conclusion that sedimentation was at times very rapid indeed, and other times there were long breaks in sedimentation, but then he says, though it looks both uniform and continuous. See, the reason he wants long breaks in sedimentation is because he has to fit the millions of years in somewhere. Because if you admit that the layers were formed quickly and you want to believe in millions of years, the only place you can put the millions of years is in the gaps between the layers. Well, there's nothing. But the thing is, the fact that these layers are very flat shows you can't have millions of years because you get erosion surfaces and you haven't got that. We can see all around the world, you never see the surface as flat as you see in the rock layers. It's never that flat. And also you have things between the layers which clearly can't last very long. If you don't believe me, leave a footprint outside and tell me if you can find it a week later, for instance. Okay? But the point is, when you find footprints, you know they must have been cemented really quickly, otherwise they would be eroded. You see, they will claim that this top layer is millions of years after the bottom layer. But then how do the footprints survive the erosion for millions of years? Back in Australia, they actually found some footprints of dinosaurs. They uncovered a top layer. We've got some dinosaur footprints, great tourist attraction, dinosaur footprints discovered. But as soon as they opened up the top layer, they had to build a shed over it to stop erosion eating them away. So again, how could the top layer be millions of years or even a week after the bottom layer, because the footprints just wouldn't be there? So over and over again, we see the very strong evidence that we have for rapid formation of the layers, as the flood would predict, but also no time gap between the layers, or very little time gap, which is consistent with the flood ebbing and flowing and depositing one layer after another. You see, the flood was coming up on the land, but it wouldn't come up uniformly because you have the earth rotating, so you have the ebbing and flowing. As the flood gradually rises, it will still come back, and every time it comes forward, it deposits some new stuff. As the water slows down, it drops its load, picks something up, and then drops it somewhere else. So you're getting one layer deposited very quickly after another layer, and in the process, burying lots of fossils. So, but the thing is, this also shows no time gap is even possible. This is the thing, that all these layers in the Grand Canyon must have been formed almost really quickly, and not slowly and gradually. There are a few other things as well which are very interesting. Like, for instance, carbon-14 dating is a big problem for a lot of people. People think it proves millions of years. If they think that, they don't know anything about carbon-14 dating, by the way, because carbon-14 is a radioactive isotope that decays extremely quickly. Because they measure decay in half-life. You see, after one half-life, only one half of the stuff is left. After 2, half-life is a quarter left. Then after 3, there's 1/8 left. So by measuring the amount of parent isotope and what they call the daughter isotope, you can supposedly work out the age of stuff. But when it comes to carbon-14, the half-life is about 5,500 years. So do the math, and you'll see that even after 1 million years, there shouldn't be any carbon-14 in anything. If the whole Earth was pure carbon-14, it should all have decayed. You wouldn't be able to detect any after 1 million years. And yet we're finding carbon-14 in coal and even in diamonds. Now, diamonds are supposed to be over 1 billion years old. Now, one thing about diamond, it's a form of carbon itself, and it's the hardest substance on Earth. Well, apart from the human heart, anyway. Okay. But see, we find carbon-14 in these diamonds, which means they cannot be millions of years old because the carbon-14 would have all disintegrated if they were that old. So, in fact, carbon-14 is, in fact, a powerful ally of the biblical timescale. And that's why I wrote an article in our Creation magazine, which you have a chance to sign up for at our table, Creation magazine. It's been going for 35 years. And goes to over 100 countries in the world, and this is one of the articles in it. Diamonds, a creationist's best friend. Now, I just want to remind you just a few things of why we do these sorts of things. I just want to mention that, for instance, here's one of the rare breed, a Christian university professor at a secular university, who said, we have tons of evidence, basically. If Christianity dies in America, it'll not be for a lack of evidence of its truthfulness. It'll be for a lack of dissemination of the evidence. And who's going to disseminate it? It has to be the body of Christ, because the government school system won't, and nor will the secular media. And that's why we have this room full of resources to help you do this. This is the only way to get the evidence out. And also, I mean, even though you're going to listen very carefully and take all these notes, you still won't remember everything you hear in a talk. So the best thing is to get some resources that will help you carry it on. Like, for instance, can any of you answer these sorts of questions here? If God made things, who made God? And what about carbon-14 dating? What about dinosaurs? And where did Cain get his wife when he wasn't able? And one of the books we're having, I think you got a good special for this because we're actually offering this quite cheap for the conference, is the Creation Answers book, which has 60 questions in 20 different chapters. Now, last thing I'm going to talk about is a bit of things about design, because we're talking about real science supporting the Bible. I'm hoping that I was supporting the biblical timescale and the reality of the global flood, because when you have the global flood, you've got an explanation for all the rock layers and all the fossils, and therefore you don't need millions of years when you have the flood to lay down those layers pretty quickly. But the thing is, I mean, Darwin himself actually started off as a geologist before he was a biologist. And it was this whole idea of slow and gradual changes over millions of years in geology leading to the landforms we see. Now let's apply this to biology. Slow and gradual changes over millions of years leading to all the life forms we see, including man. So in fact, it was geological evolution that led to biological evolution. So when there are certain organizations around who want to attack biological evolution but don't want to attack the root of biological evolution, which is the billions of years. And they don't want to defend the reality of the flood. But in fact, we should be doing this. But in fact, the arguments for design are incredibly powerful arguments against Dawkins and Darwin. But Dawkins himself had to admit that biology is a study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Sorry, talking about the flood makes you thirsty. And this is what the Apostle Paul tells us too, that the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so they are without excuse. So no one, not Dawkins, not Darwin, have an excuse for denying a creator from what has been made. So let's look at this. Look, we make things ourselves, right? Like this aeroplane, you've got a Boeing factory in this state, haven't we? So what do we know about design things? Well, one thing is that they have lots of correct components. But you realize a plane is made up 100% of non-flying parts. So how do I get back to Atlanta then? Well, the answer is they are organized correctly. So correct components, but also correct organization. And when you have organization, you know there is an organizer. Now compare man-made things to living things. Living things are far more complicated because they have to be able to copy themselves. Now, a Boeing factory can make lots of jet planes, but a Boeing factory won't make another Boeing factory. But living cells can make other living cells. I mean, living things, your children are sort of like copies of you. And your body is made up of 100 trillion cells. And your cells are making copies of themselves. That's how your body repairs itself. Because cells are copying each other, are copying themselves. Now, a photocopier copies documents for you, but again, a photocopier will not make you another photocopier. But living things will do this. And they have enormous amounts of complexity in them. And I'll show you, the evolutionists have no real way of explaining where the first living cell came from. I mean, the usual idea is some sort of energy flow in a primordial soup billions of years ago. But does energy really do that? Well, think about this. Again, we're talking about jumbos in Seattle. I better talk about Boeing things, haven't I? Now, the thing is, would a jumbo jet be formed by a tornado through a junkyard? But no, it's the other way around, isn't it? And the reason, a tornado going through there would actually destroy a Boeing and turn it into a junkyard. And the reason is there are far more ways of being disorganized than being organized. So it's a simple matter of probability that energy is just going to help things reach the more disorganized state because there's just so many more ways of being in that disorganized state. And another example would be a frog in a blender. Now, when you turn the switch on, you're adding energy to it, right? And what's the result here? It's a frog smoothie, okay? So why did the frog die? It was disorganized, you see. That's what energy did, it disorganized it. Now you think if I left this going for millions of years that a frog will hop out of there again. But you realize also you could sterilize and seal this, put it into a can, and it's safe to eat for millions of years. And the reason is no germ will grow in there. The only way you're going to get contamination and food poisoning is if the seal was broken and the germ got in from outside. But see, in this frog smoothie, you've got far more chemicals for life than any primordial soup could ever produce. And yet we know very well that it's safe to eat canned food. And you see, you could treat every can of food as a laboratory to test whether evolution makes sense. Because you've got all the chemicals, you've got all the energy you need, but no living things will form in there. See, evolution is actually not science, because evolution says that once upon a time, non-living chemicals produced a living cell. That is an act of faith. It's not a position of science. Because real science says that life only comes from life. It's called the law of biogenesis. And when you see how complicated living things are, I think you'll see what I'm talking about. Like, for instance, every living cell has this following motor that I'm going to show you.
This animated sequence shows the ATP synthase enzyme in operation. The animation is based on an incredible series of scientific discoveries. Only the colors show artistic license. ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, is the energy currency of the cell. ATP is produced by a tiny molecular rotary motor, rotating at up to 7,000 RPM. These are so small that 100,000 would fit side by side in a millimeter. A current of protons drives the motor, unlike man-made electric motors which use electrons. This portion of the enzyme is where adenosine diphosphate is combined with a phosphate ion in the presence of a catalyst to produce ATP, which is then released, making way for the next cycle. A top view of the enzyme shows the sequential operation. Almost every biochemical process in your body requires ATP. Such a nanomachine exhibits all the characteristics of super-intelligent design. ATP is vital for life, and many of these motors were needed before the first living cell could exist. An evolutionary impossibility.
So your body has about 100 trillion cells. Each of those cells has thousands of these motors working because your body makes its own weight in ATP every day and consumes it. And cyanide kills you by stopping the motor getting its electrical power source. And death follows very quickly from cyanide poisoning because ATP is no longer being produced. So you get the idea, ATP is extremely important for life. And it's made by these amazing motors. Now your cells have other motors as well. And this one is called Kinsman, and it works a bit differently from what I showed you there, but it's still pretty amazing.
Inside a living cell is an amazing transportation system. Proteins have to be delivered to the correct part of the cell to perform their intended functions. This animation, based on a lot of clever research over a number of years, shows how it happens. Highways made of microtubules are assembled by interlocking proteins, each manufactured in accordance with the coded instructions on the cell's DNA. Marching along a microtubule is the kinesin motor, the hero of our story, carrying a huge sack of proteins to be delivered to a predetermined place in the cell. Here, the proteins will be released to fulfill their functions. A kinesin linear motor uses 1 ATP to provide the energy for each step and takes 125,000 steps to cover 1 millimeter. This amazing machine shows all the hallmarks of design.
And after this video is produced, they found that it actually has a locking mechanism that actually stops it moving, so conserves ATP from being wasted. In fact, the other motor also has some sort of locking mechanism too. So it's quite interesting how you got all these amazing designs to conserve energy in these motors by stopping them from being used when we don't need them. Now, the thing is, not only do we have these amazing machines, we have the instruction manual for them too. Now, think about this. I mean, if your Martian found if there were real Martians, they found our Martian rover left behind by NASA, and that's because they confused metrics and American units for some reason, wasn't it? But anyway, they would find the Martian land rover. They would conclude it was designed, wouldn't they? But what would really convince them is that they found the instruction manual in the glove compartment there. This is what we have in our cell, though. We actually have the instruction manual in a sort of glove compartment of our cell called the nucleus. And it's the famous DNA molecule. And 60 years ago, this is the 60th anniversary of the discovery of the double helix of DNA, which stands for National Dyslexia Association. Well, deoxyribonucleic acid, really, okay? Now, it's actually a very complicated chemical molecule. It's a very elaborate structure here. It's got sugar, it's got phosphate, it's got these so-called these nucleobases. And the nucleobases form rungs of a ladder. So every rotation, there's 10 rungs of a ladder. And the rungs actually help to stabilize it a bit chemically, which is very important because DNA is actually a very unstable molecule. Here is an expert on this area. There's a general belief that DNA is rock solid, but in fact it's extremely highly reactive. On a good day, about 1 million bases in the DNA in a human cell are damaged. So each of your cells is suffering 1 million letter damages. Now, that's quite a lot because, in fact, you've got about 3 billion letters in each of your cells. So 1 million of those a day, you'd be a mutated mess really quickly. Now, the only reason you're not is because we got these amazing repair machines. Now, a primordial soup would not have these repair machines. So the idea of DNA forming in a primordial soup doesn't make any chemical sense. It's just too unstable. It would break down rather than being formed. Now, there's a popular view that life began with RNA, but RNA is actually less stable than DNA. So the RNA world makes no sense chemically because these things are just too unstable. They break down really quickly. Now, it's a very good thing that we have these repair machines, but this actually becomes a sort of chicken and egg problem for evolutionists. You know what I mean? Which came first, the chicken or the egg, that sort of thing? Because the instructions to build the repair machines are on the DNA, but you need repair machines to stop those instructions being corrupted. So you see how they had to be there together. You couldn't have one without the other. And the thing is, each of your cells has about 3 billion letters. In fact, that's the equivalent of about 1,000 Bible-sized books. to write out 3 billion letters in paper and ink. Or if you like 3 gigabytes, if you treat one letter as a byte, which is rough, is a good ballpark, you've got 3 gigabytes in each of your cells. Now, see, the books here are written in ink molecules on paper, but did the information in the books come from the ink molecules? Well, if you think it did, try pouring ink on paper and see if you get a book out of it. No, the information doesn't come from the ink, it comes from outside. It's a mind who arranged the ink molecules in the form of letters, then words and sentences and paragraphs. And the same way with DNA, there's nothing in the chemical letters of DNA that makes them line up in any way. Again, the order in DNA is imposed from outside. Again, evidence of a message sender, a programmer. You might say a book requires an author. Well, our DNA is in our cells is basically 1,000 books which require an author for those books. That's what we have. That's what DNA is, very powerful evidence that we have a master designer for that. Now, another thing about DNA is that it has to be decoded. And there are amazing machines that help to decode the DNA information. And here's an animation of a few of them.
This animation demonstrates how the digital information encoded within DNA is used to direct protein synthesis. This is a DNA double helix containing the digital code which directs the cell in all aspects of operation. And here we see a protein complex called an RNA polymerase traveling down the DNA strand. As it moves down the strand, it carefully unwinds the DNA, preparing it for transcription. Inside the polymerase, we see a single-stranded copy of the original instructions being assembled as individual bases are positioned and added to the growing strand. A stop code marks the end of the protein specification, at which point this copy, known as a messenger RNA transcript, exits the polymerase and heads towards a 2-part chemical manufacturing machine called the ribosome. While the messenger RNA moves towards the ribosome, transfer RNA molecules attach to specific amino acids in preparation for assembly. As the messenger RNA transcript passes through the ribosome, the process of translation begins. Using the instructions encoded on the messenger RNA as a template, the transfer RNA molecules align specific sequences of bases to corresponding amino acids, creating a protein chain. As this chain exits the ribosome, it is met by chaperones which prevent premature folding, while escorting the protein to a barrel-shaped machine called a chaperonin. This machine helps fold the protein into the precise shape required to perform its function. Although it is unclear how the chaperonin achieves this, we do know that accurate folding is essential in order for the protein to accomplish its intended function. Once the protein is complete, it is released into the cytoplasm to do its job.
And sometimes this will be picked up be bundled up and then transported by the kinesin to where it belongs in the cell. That's one of the previous motors I showed you. Now, here's another evolutionary conundrum. It's another sort of chicken and egg problem, that the DNA is useless without the decoding machines, but the instructions to build those decoding machines I showed you are on the DNA. But they can't be read without decoding machines already there. So again, which came first, the decoding machines or the instructions to build them, which have to be read by decoding machines? And you might say it's even a three-way chicken and egg problem, whatever you call that, because the decoding machines use ATP for their energy, or at least most of them use ATP. But the thing is, the ATP is made by those motors using instructions on the DNA read by decoding machines using ATP made by motors. So all those things have to be working together, otherwise they won't work at all. And it's interesting, an evolutionary expert like Paul Davies said that most of the workings of a cell are best described not in terms of material stuff, hardware, but as information or software. He points out no law of physics able to create information from nothing, so how do stupid atoms spontaneously write their own software? Nobody knows. And if you want to know a bit more, this DVD called God the Master Designer has those animations on them, plus a lot more as well. And my own favorite book to write was called By Design, which has a chapter on the origin of life, but plenty of other amazing designs in living things. And one of my favorite examples is when humans are trying to copy God's design. There's a field called biomimicry or biomimetics. And it's happening more and more that human designers, the most brilliant ones, are trying to copy what they see in nature. Now, one other thing I wanted to mention is why evolution won't work. I've shown you that the origin of first life is a big problem because evolution by natural selection, which is the Darwinian viewpoint, has this problem. As Anthony Flew recognized, that Darwinian evolution requires something that already possessed reproductive powers, because natural selection requires that you select for something and then you can reproduce and pass on what you've selected for. So you need to have something that's reproducing. So you cannot use natural selection to explain the first life with all this complexity I showed you. That has to be explained somewhere else. Now, Anthony Flew was known as the best atheist philosopher in the world, the top atheist. And yet he became a theist just before he died, a few years before he died. And of course, the atheists called him a traitor and all these things. The point is, this evidence was actually instrumental in converting him away from atheism, because he says, this is the creature, the evolution of which a truly comprehensive theory of evolution must give some account. Darwin was well aware that he had not produced such an account. And it seems to me that the findings of more than 50 years of DNA research have produced materials for a new and enormously powerful argument to design. So when people think this is a side issue, well, it clearly wasn't a side issue for the world's top atheist philosopher. But okay, once you've got the first living cell, which you're not going to get by evolution, what do you go from there? Because evolution's supposed to tell us that we start from the single cell, and every other living thing comes from that single cell, which itself came from a primordial soup, which is why I call this from goo to you via the zoo. But do we see any evidence for that? I mean, Chris is going to talk about the fossil record, but you don't see the links in between these things. But even more foundational than that is, in fact, this process requires information to go uphill, because the primordial soup hasn't got any information. In fact, you're lucky if you can even get some of the letters of information in the primordial soup. And the first living cell, the simplest living cell, has about 600 kilobytes worth of information, and humans have 3 gigabytes worth. So if evolution were true, information must be going uphill. But do we actually see this? Well, let's give you an example. It's one of Darwin's favorite examples, the breeds of dogs. So what I've got here are 2 doggies, and they've got a sort of medium length of fur, because on their belly, this is actually meant to be a symbol for DNA, a gene, part of your DNA that codes for long fur. And this one here codes for short fur. Now, we have information in pairs. You had one half from your mum, one half from your dad. And when you marry, you pass on half, your spouse passes on the other half, so your kids look like both of you. So when these dogs marry and have pups, they will pass on one or the other. Both these dogs will pass on either the short or the long. I mean, they could both pass on the short fur gene, and the offspring will look like this. And you can see how it's got shorter fur. Now, they could pass on one of each. I mean, you get the mum passing on a short fur, the dad passing on the long fur, or vice versa, and you get like this, a medium fur like their parents. Or else they could both pass on their long fur gene. And the pup looks like this. So the thing is, Darwin didn't know about genetics. That was a creationist, Gregor Mendel, who discovered genetics. And see, Darwin thought we have 2 new varieties, a short fur and a long fur. But in reality, in fact, God had already programmed that information in the original breed. And all we're seeing is sorting out the information that was already there. This is it's nothing to do with turning bacteria into biologists. Even if this went on for millions of years, it has nothing whatsoever to do with turning prokaryotes into professors, or amoebas into anthropologists, or, get the idea. Now, what Darwin wanted to do is go a step further. Let's do a step further and imagine these dogs go through the Ice Age, which probably happened after the flood, actually. There was a gigantic ice age, and the flood was the what caused the Ice Age. The cause of the Ice Age was the flood. Now, which of these dogs is going to do better in the Ice Age, do you think? The furry ones are protected from the cold. So the other ones are going to die of the cold. So the only ones that pass on their information are these furry ones. So the next generation has long fur. Now you see, this is actually natural selection in operation, but natural selection has nothing to do with evolution. Because it's culling. It's a culling force, not a creative force. The natural selection has actually removed the genes for short fur. So if the weather warmed up, these doggies could overheat because they've no longer got the information for short fur. So again, this is actually going downhill in information. And again, you can have this going for millions of years and you're not going to go get new stuff from that. Because natural selection is always removing stuff. And in fact, it removes everything that these doggies carried. So in fact, this breed of dogs is very well adapted for the cold, but it's actually depleted in information because it's lost all the information these ones have carried. Not just the short fur. If this dog happened to be the best runner of the lot, again, that's gone. Because natural selection kills the whole creature, not just the gene. So this, again, is not going to produce new information. Now, the only thing that's going to, the evolutionists have is mutation, and Dr. Bergman's going to talk about mutation in a lot of detail, but just briefly, mutations tend to corrupt information. It's a typo when genes are copied. And why do you think you have typo correcting on your word processor? Because typos make things worse. And once again, there are far more ways of making something worse than making something better. So this poor doggy has to be born by C-section. And this is something as well, totally naked rooster. That's why it's called what it means. And of course, Chick-fil-A would like this because no need to pluck it. And I like Chick-fil-A because they support biblical marriage. But point is, this is no good for the rooster, though. It's good for the people who don't have to pluck it, but no good for the poor rooster who freezes in winter and fries in summer. So mutations aren't going to be the way of going about things either. So mutations instead cause lots of disease. So again, what I've shown you is, just to summarize this point here, well, first of all, I talked about how origin of first life was impossible, and natural selection cannot explain origin of first life. But then what I've shown you is examples not of the information going uphill, which is what's required. I've shown you that what we see is sorting out what's already there. And I see natural selection culling information, and I see mutations that only corrupt the information. We don't see information going uphill. And in fact, even Richard Dawkins was asked about this, where the information came from. Here we go.
Professor Dawkins, can you give an example of a genetic mutation or an evolutionary process which can be seen to increase the information in the genome?
And Dawkins also said evolution has been observed. It's just that it hasn't been observed while it's happening. And just to let you know, it's really it's a worldview thing, because his whole reason for believing in evolution is because Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. That's why he has to cling so desperately to evolution, because it's a crutch for his atheistic faith. And that's why he wrote books like this one, to try to show where he goes wrong. And hopefully I'm doing that to fulfill what the Apostle Paul said, to demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. I didn't say demolish the person, I said demolish the arguments. That's a biblical command. And the point is, we don't stop at just disproving evolution or even proving a designer. We want to take every thought to make it obedient to Christ, who is the creator of the universe. Okay? So thanks very much for listening to me.